What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another Pacifism community commentary, the series where I analyse other people's gameplay and try and suggest ways they might improve their game. Today's gameplay comes courtesy of a YouTuber called MilkySteak. I'd like to thank him very much for submitting his run, and I'd encourage you all to go check out his channel. He's got a couple of Pacifism runs on there, some Call of Duty, and a video on geometry that was a bit different to Geometry Wars. It's pretty interesting. His top score, which this run consists of, is just over 650 million. And as such, I hope this particular episode is one that quite a lot of viewers can relate to. Because I'm sure 400, 500, 600 million is a really common high score. Anyone who's just on the threshold of trying to break a billion will probably be able to relate to this. So hopefully my commentary will be useful for a lot of people. Just before the gameplay begins, this one was quite difficult for me to do because when I was watching the gameplay, if I hadn't known what the score was and what his own background and high score was, I'd assume that it was the gameplay of somebody who'd definitely beaten a billion before, because I think his style was really good, and it just doesn't look like the style of somebody who hasn't yet beaten a billion. So I was a bit puzzled, to be honest, by what's going on here. So I think what I'm going to do is, we'll go through it twice, and the first time I'll just pick out all the things I think is good about his style, because sometimes knowing what you're doing right, in the opinion of someone else anyway, knowing what you're doing right can be as useful as knowing what you need to improve upon, because you can stop stressing about it and you can try and maybe build your gameplay around those features. And then we'll go through it again, and I'll try and see what's gone wrong in this gameplay that means that a style that should equate to a billion, at least I think, hasn't done. And prior to this score, MilkySteak had been, I think, struggling to get beyond 400 million for quite a while. So this is a pretty interesting one. So let's get right to it. So as you can see, his previous high score was 473 million, and I like his way of beginning here. It's basically what I do, which is just using one gate to destroy each spawn in its totality, keeping things very simple. I think it's such a small thing, but it really, starting the game that way really puts my mind in the right place, I think, of having in mind how much damage one gate can do. Just very simple explosions, and you'll see really right off the bat that his technique of using gates is exactly what I always try and recommend, which is he tries to explode them at the point that they're pointing into the pack of enemies. So the orange part is pointing into the enemies. Like there, he waits and waits until it's at the right moment. You can't always do it, but it's very obvious watching this that he's mindful, like there. He's mindful of where the gates are before he destroys them. And that really is the key thing that he's clearly beyond. He's thinking about how he's hitting the gates. And after he's exploded each gate, he's not just flying away or trying to go back on himself later. He's flying into the cloud of enemies as he explodes the gates. In a style that I base my entire game around, because it allows you to collect the geome. And if we just stop it here, you'll see that his geome count is at 2,000 at 80 million. And that's the exact benchmark that I go for. So if this means anything, if it was me doing this run, I'd be perfectly happy with that first 80 million. I consider it a successful run, which is a good platform on which to build. So I'd say in terms of his first 80 million, I wouldn't worry about changing a single thing. Keeping simple. He didn't fly into any dangerous corners for no reason. He's thinking before detonating the gates. He's flying into the clouds after detonating them to ensure that he collects the geome, and that causes the blues to wind in on themselves, which is something I've talked about a lot in previous tutorials. So at this stage, I'd say it's textbook. Carry on. So moving on from that really good start, there are two further things that impressed me a lot about this run. Now, in addition to the way that he flies into the clouds after hitting a gate like there, he's got a very good habit of, even when he can't fly into the gate, fly into the cloud, he'll still go back on himself after detonating any gate that's close to the cloud. That is a really high level tactic, I'd say, to be mindful of doing that, because it's always just shepherding the blues back in on themselves, which is where you want them. If you keep watching, he'll always be doing this. And related to that, he's not at all worried about stopping and letting the cloud come in on him before detonating, to make sure it's as near as possible to the gate, which is always generally pointing the right way, before exploding it. He's not constantly moving. He doesn't feel that when he stops he's in danger. Yes, he's always, these movements are things that I would associate with somebody who's gotten to this stage several times before and isn't worried about dying, and that's the attitude you need to have. And here, if he'd got on those 2 gates there, he would have gotten out of that. Which means it was just quite unlucky. You make those decisions, sometimes they go your way, sometimes they don't. But maybe you can see now why I'm a little bit puzzled by this one, because I'd say he's doing all the things that I would recommend to someone who's in the 400-500 range and is trying to improve. He's hitting the gates technically very well. He's not just flying around constantly, which is how you get into trouble and get into bad places. He's stopping, composing himself, waiting until the gates are really deep in on the cloud before exploding them. He's shepherding the blues. Even when the gates aren't aligned quite right, he's still moving in a really intelligent way that will ensure the clouds of blues go back on themselves. He's doing everything right, really. So what's going wrong? Why has he not gotten the score that technique should equate with? Well, I think it's mostly a case of making small refinements, and I'll say right now that even if you just stop the video here, MilkySteak, if you just keep trying and concentrate on these things, you're doing really well. You will certainly hit 1 billion. But if we go through it again, hopefully I'll be able to point out a few refinements that could be made that will help push you over the edge and onto greater things, in a good way. So the first thing was really designed to build on MilkySteak's really good gate technique. And what it is, I'd encourage him to be more mindful of how he moves before detonating gates, as well as how he moves afterwards. Because obviously, like I've pointed out, the way he moves after he explodes gates is very good, but sometimes the way he flies towards gates doesn't make full advantage of how the gate is turning. So if we look here, there are 2 gates there at the bottom of the screen, and the top of those 2, one further up, is turning in a counter-clockwise direction. Now the main cluster of blues is that one that's behind him and is heading towards him, so that's one he wants to try and detonate. Now, because of the way the gate is turning, if he now flies to the right of it as it turns towards a more vertical direction, the blues will follow him in such a way that when he gets near to the gate and is ready to explode it, they'll be directly on the end, on the orange part of that gate, and he'll be able to explode the entire thing without a doubt. But what he does instead is he flies to the left of it, and they're not quite as on the end as they would have been. This is a case partly of just intuitive decision making, but also just looking at how gates are moving and anticipating their movement, and what the best thing is for you to do before you explode them, which will complement the damage that they're going to inflict. Now, like I said before, he does a very good job of manoeuvring the blues so they end up in good proximity to the orange part of the gates before detonating them. But oftentimes, if you fly to one side of the gate rather than the other, a decision you make based on the way it's turning, you'll be able to just get so much more damage. So that's one thing. If you just bear that in mind as you watch the rest of the run, you'll see that a lot of the time, if he'd flown to the other side of the gate rather than the one he chooses to, he would have gotten a much better bang for his buck. So that's the first thing. And you'll see there it wasn't quite as much on the end as it could have been. And I guess what this comes down to is the difference between having the blues very, very near to the orange part, or having them actually deeply penetrated by the gate. And obviously it's the latter you want, because if you can explode the gate from within the cloud, then that's when you really get the big damage. And remember, just like at the start, exploding spawns in their entirety, clusters in their entirety is what I'm talking about here. That's what we're always really after. And here's another one coming up. If you're flying below that gate rather than above it, then he would have exploded the entire mini cluster that was there. Now moving on to the second thing, like I said, he's very good at flying into the cloud after detonating the gates, but I think he's perhaps underestimating the extent to which he can do that. I think he could have flown in deeper, and this is again something that comes with confidence, and you will go too far sometimes and die, but if you can fly in as deep as possible, then it'll just maximise the positive effects that I mentioned before. You'll get more of the geome, you wind the enemy in more on itself, and sometimes you can, if you wait and wait and wait before detonating it, you can often fly right through what looks like a really thick cluster and make difficult escapes. Just try not to underestimate how much damage these gates will inflict if used correctly. And he almost gets better at this as he goes along. I think he starts flying in deeper and deeper, and that's really good. And it's really just a nuance that you can add to your game. Like I say, really try and concentrate on the good things you're doing and do them even better. But if you can hit the clouds as deeply and go in as deeply as you do later in this run, MilkySteak, I'm addressing you directly now it seems, it'll ensure that you're under less pressure as the run proceeds. That could have been deeper for sure, and you possibly could have waited longer. But this was new territory now, so it's totally understandable if things get a little less technically precise. Now, a final thing I almost feel bad about recommending, because what I like about this technique is how technically kind of pure it is. It's not prone to chance or making stupid risks, it's really good. But I do think to really survive into the billions, perhaps, what's needed is to take more chances with more gates. Here, I feel bad about recommending this, but he has a chance to go into an area loaded with gates, but instead he takes on the ones that are certainties, hits them quite well, and then flies away. But the thing is, this does mean he then has to go a little while without hitting any gates. And again here, he's got a chance to really make hay with multiple gates and stay around in that area, but instead he kind of takes a few of them and leaves. And I think what it might take, what it inevitably takes at some point, is to stick around in those difficult areas and make each gate count in the way I was describing previously that he does very well, making sure you hit the gate just right, going in deep, but also doing it in a way that might get you killed. Unfortunately, that's a risk you have to take, and maybe this is the thing that kind of solves the puzzle. I think MilkySteak is a technically excellent player already, but just it's only one run, so maybe it's unfair to make wild extrapolations. But if I had to guess, I'd assume that perhaps he's slightly averse to risk taking and going into multiple gate situations where suddenly things are less in your hands and are more down to contingency. You'll see lesser players on YouTube, certainly certain machinima players I could talk about, who are nowhere near as good as that and just fly around stupidly. But because they get lucky, they play it a lot and they get lucky and they'll hit multiple gates, they'll just blunder their way to a billion. But it annoys me that someone who's taking a lot of care about their gameplay isn't getting the scores quite they deserve. I would say just don't worry about dying, know that you're good enough to get to a billion, and just try and get comfortable really with those more dangerous situations. I'm not saying for 1 second you should deliberately seek out dangerous situations, and if you can get by without taking them on, or if they don't even appear, then that's great. It's always got to be a case of judging risk versus reward, and in that case I think the reward would have been a higher score if you'd successfully taken a risk of going into that situation. So I think I'm talking around in circles now. I think overall summary, MilkySteak, very good player, keep doing what you're doing, take more risks, but use your best judgment, because either way you'll get to a billion soon. I hope this has been helpful.